Some of the biggest songs of the 1970s did not come out of nowhere. Behind the radio hits and the platinum records, there were older melodies, borrowed chord progressions, and in some cases, full-blown legal battles that dragged on for years. A few of these stories ended in settlements, others ended in courtrooms, and some changed the way the music industry thought about ownership forever. These are the top 15 songs from the 1970s that rip off other songs. Number 15, My Sweet Lord by George Harrison.
My sweet Lord.
When George Harrison released My Sweet Lord in November 1970, it became one of the fastest-selling singles in history. It was the lead single from his triple album All Things Must Pass, and it shot to number 1 in the United Kingdom, the United States, and across much of the world within weeks. For Harrison, it was the defining moment of his solo career, proof that he could carry a record on his own, outside the shadow of the Beatles.
My sweet Lord.
The problem surfaced quickly. Bright Tunes Music Corporation, which owned the rights to the 1963 Chiffons hit He's So Fine, filed a lawsuit claiming the melody of My Sweet Lord was lifted directly from their song. The case, Bright Tunes Music Corp. v. Harris Songs Music, became one of the most closely watched copyright cases in music history.
He's so fine.
The trial took place in 1976, presided over by Judge Richard Owen in the Southern District of New York. Judge Owen ruled that while Harrison had not deliberately set out to copy He's So Fine, he had engaged in what the judge called subconscious plagiarism, meaning the melody had lodged itself in Harrison's memory without him realizing it, and resurfaced when he wrote My Sweet Lord. The court found in favor of Bright Tunes.
Really wanna know you. Really wanna.
The damages portion of the case dragged on for years, complicated further by a strange twist. Harrison's manager, Alan Klein, purchased Bright Tunes Music Corporation during the litigation, creating a conflict of interest that complicated the proceedings considerably. Harrison eventually paid approximately $1.6 million in damages. The case remains the foundational legal precedent for the concept of subconscious plagiarism in copyright law. Harrison always maintained that he had not consciously borrowed the melody. Whether it was theft or coincidence, the lawsuit followed the song for the rest of its life. Number 14, Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin.
Yes, there are 2,000 go by.
Stairway to Heaven was released on Led Zeppelin's fourth album in November 1971, and it became, over the following decades, one of the most played rock songs in radio history. The guitar introduction, those ascending arpeggios played on a 12-string acoustic, is among the most recognized opening passages in popular music. It also sits at the center of a copyright dispute that ran in one form or another for decades. The claim came from the estate of Randy California, the guitarist and co-founder of the band Spirit. Spirit had released an instrumental piece called Taurus in 1968, composed by California, whose legal name was Randy Craig Wolf. The opening guitar figure of Taurus bears a substantial resemblance to the introduction of Stairway to Heaven, and Led Zeppelin and Spirit had shared bills on the same tours in 1968 and 1969, meaning Jimmy Page and Robert Plant had almost certainly heard Taurus performed live before Stairway to Heaven was written. The legal action was filed formally in 2014 by Michael Skidmore, a trustee for Randy California's estate. California himself had drowned in 1997, but he had spoken in interviews years before his death about what he believed was an unacknowledged borrowing. The case went to trial in 2016. A jury found in favor of Led Zeppelin, concluding that the chord sequence and ascending bass line, the elements shared between the two pieces, were common musical building blocks not protectable under copyright. The verdict was upheld on appeal in 2020 and affirmed again by a full panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Number 13, Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin. 2 years before the Stairway to Heaven controversy took shape, Led Zeppelin were already dealing with accusations of borrowing that would follow them throughout their career. Whole Lotta Love, released in 1969 on Led Zeppelin II, was one of the defining hard rock tracks of its era. but its lyrics bore an unmistakable resemblance to You Need Love, a song written by Willie Dixon and recorded by Muddy Waters in 1962, and later by the Small Faces in 1966. Willie Dixon was one of the most important figures in Chicago blues, a songwriter, bassist, and producer whose compositions formed the backbone of the electric blues genre. He had already been through one dispute with Led Zeppelin over Bring It On Home. Another track from Led Zeppelin II and Whole Lotta Love represented a more significant second case. Dixon filed suit in 1985, and the matter was settled out of court. Dixon received a financial settlement and a songwriting credit on the track. The song's official credits were amended accordingly. Dixon pursued several similar cases against Led Zeppelin during this period, and the settlements changed the writing credits on multiple tracks in the band's catalog. The case is part of a broader pattern in the history of early rock, one in which blues compositions by black artists were appropriated by rock acts who achieved far greater commercial success with material they had not originated. Dixon's persistence in pursuing those claims legally was an act of considerable significance. Number 12. Rapper's Delight by the Sugar Hill Gang. When Rapper's Delight was released in September 1979, it became the first hip-hop single to reach the top 40 of the Billboard Hot 100, peaking at number 36 and charting internationally. For most listeners at the time, it was their first real exposure to rap music, and it introduced an entirely new genre to a mainstream audience that had never encountered anything quite like it. The track was built on top of the bass line and chord structure from Good Times, the 1979 disco hit by Chic. Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards, who wrote and produced Good Times, had not been asked for permission and had not been informed that their music was going to be used. When they heard Rapper's Delight on the radio, they were, by their own accounts, initially shocked and then furious. The matter was resolved through negotiation rather than a full court hearing. Rodgers and Edwards were added to the songwriting credits of Rapper's Delight and received royalties from the recording. The settlement was reached relatively quickly, partly because the borrowing was so direct that there was little ambiguity about the source. The case carries a significance beyond the specific dispute. It was one of the earliest prominent examples of sampling. At the time, there were no established legal frameworks for how sampling should work. Rapper's Delight and the Chic dispute helped set in motion the industry conversations that eventually produced the clearance system that exists today. Many artists whose work was sampled without permission in those early years never received proper compensation, but the Rodgers and Edwards case was among the first to establish that taking someone else's music without credit carried real legal consequences.
My name is known all over the world by all the foxy ladies and the pretty girls.
Number 11. Got to Give It Up by Marvin Gaye. Got to Give It Up was released in 1977 and became one of Marvin Gaye's biggest commercial hits of the decade, reaching number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The track has a loose, party-like atmosphere, cowbells, a shuffling groove, and a sense of spontaneity that sounded unlike much of what was on the radio at the time. The most prominent dispute attached to this song came decades later, in 2013, when the producers of Robin Thicke's Blurred Lines brought a preemptive lawsuit against the Gaye estate, seeking a declaration that their song did not infringe on Got to Give It Up. The Gaye family countersued, and the case went to trial in 2015. The jury found in favor of the Gaye estate, a verdict upheld on appeal in 2018. Many music scholars argued the verdict extended copyright protection too far, covering an overall feel and groove rather than specific notes or lyrics, something copyright law had historically not protected. What the case confirmed is that Got to Give It Up had a sound distinctive enough that a jury believed another song had been built in deliberate imitation of it, which is precisely what made it the subject of litigation 40 years after it was recorded.
You got to give it up. Just keep on dancing, lady.
Number 10. A Horse with No Name by America.
I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be.
America released A Horse with No Name in 1971 in the United Kingdom and early 1972 in the United States, where it reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March 1972. The band was formed in London by the sons of American servicemen stationed in the United Kingdom, and their sound drew heavily from the acoustic folk rock that was dominant in California at the time.
In the desert, you can't remember your name because the rain.
The similarity to Neil Young's work was noticed almost immediately. Radio listeners and critics pointed out that the lead vocal delivery, the acoustic guitar texture, and the general atmosphere of A Horse with No Name sounded remarkably close to what Young had been doing on records like Harvest and After the Gold Rush. Young himself reportedly joked about the resemblance more than once. Notably, both A Horse with No Name and Young's Heart of Gold were at the top of the charts simultaneously in early 1972.
Keep me searching for a heart of gold.
No formal legal action was ever taken, and the members of America acknowledged the influence of Neil Young openly. Dewey Bunnell, who wrote the song, has said in interviews that the Young influence was real, but that the song came from his own experiences and imagery. The case is a good illustration of the difference between legal plagiarism and stylistic influence, two things that can look very similar from the outside, but are treated entirely differently by the law.
Been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be.
Number 9. Crocodile Rock by Elton John. Elton John and Bernie Taupin released Crocodile Rock in 1972, and it became one of the most commercially successful singles of John's career, reaching number 1 in the United States in early 1973. John and Taupin have said in interviews that they were consciously trying to write something that captured the feeling of early 1960s rock and roll. The kind of music they had grown up listening to before the British invasion changed everything. The song drew comparisons to several earlier recordings almost immediately. The melody and structure have been noted as bearing similarities to "Oh Carol" by Neil Sedaka from 1959, to "Little Darling" by the Diamonds from 1957, and to various other early rock and roll records of the late 1950s. Neil Sedaka himself has mentioned the similarity to "Oh Carol" in interviews over the years, though with more amusement than grievance. No legal proceedings were ever filed. The resemblances are best understood as the natural consequence of what John and Taupin were consciously attempting. A song that sounds like it belongs to a specific era inevitably sounds like other songs from that era, because those songs shared common structures, tempos, and chord patterns, but the comparison to Sedaka is specific enough that it has followed Crocodile Rock throughout its life. Number 8. Come Together by the Beatles.
Come together right now.
Come Together was released in September 1969 as the lead single from Abbey Road. John Lennon wrote the song originally as a campaign song for Timothy Leary's California gubernatorial run, an effort that never materialized, and it evolved into something considerably darker and stranger by the time it was recorded.
Got on no sideboard, he won't spy.
The connection to an earlier song is direct and was acknowledged by Lennon himself. Chuck Berry's You Can't Catch Me, recorded in 1956, shares an opening musical phrase and several lyrical lines with Come Together. Morris Levy, who owned the publishing rights to Berry's song through his company Big 7 Music, filed a lawsuit against Lennon and Capitol Records.
Baby, you can't catch me.
The case was settled out of court, and the resolution had an unusual consequence. As part of the agreement, Lennon agreed to record 3 songs from Levy's catalog on his next album. Lennon did record 2 of them, Ya Ya and Sweet Little 16, for his 1975 album Rock and Roll. The circumstances of how those recordings were eventually released became a separate legal dispute between Lennon and Levy, making the whole episode one of the stranger legal sagas of Lennon's solo career.
Come together right now.
Number 7. Le Freak by Chic. Chic released Le Freak in September 1978, and it became one of the best-selling singles in the history of Atlantic Records, spending 6 weeks at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards wrote and produced the track, and it became the signature sound of the Chic organization's peak commercial period. The borrowing story around Le Freak runs in an interesting direction. Rather than Chic being accused of taking from someone else, their rhythm guitar technique, the clean, percussive, syncopated guitar chop that defines the track, was itself so widely imitated that it became effectively the common property of disco and early funk production. Rodgers has spoken in interviews about hearing the technique reflected back in dozens of records made after 1978, often without any acknowledgement.
All that pressure got you down.
The more specific legal story involving Chic during this period is the Rapper's Delight case described earlier, in which their composition Good Times was used without permission, and the settlement that followed helped establish the legal ground rules for sampling. That outcome made Chic's catalog a reference point for how those rules would be written, which is a different kind of legacy than most artists of the era could claim. Number 6. Superstition by Stevie Wonder. Stevie Wonder wrote Superstition in 1972, and it was released as the lead single from his album Talking Book in October of that year, reaching number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1973. The track was constructed around a clavinet riff that has since become one of the most sampled sounds in popular music history. The borrowing story here runs in a specific direction. Wonder had originally written the song for Jeff Beck, as part of an agreement stemming from Beck's participation in the Talking Book sessions. Beck played guitar on Lookin' for Another Pure Love, and Wonder offered him a composition in return. Superstition was that song. The dispute arose when Motown released Wonder's version as a single before Beck could release his. Beck's version appeared on his 1973 album, Beck, Bogert, and Apis, but by that point, Wonder's recording had already been number 1 for weeks. Beck was frustrated about the timing for years afterward, and has documented his account of what he was promised and what actually happened in multiple interviews over the decades. Wonder has said in interviews that the decision to release his own version first was not fully in his control, as Motown moved on its own timeline. No lawsuit was ever filed. The question of who was owed what was never formally adjudicated, but Beck's account of the episode is consistent across interviews spanning 40 years, and it remains one of the more quietly contested stories behind a major 1970s hit. Number 5. Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple. Deep Purple recorded Smoke on the Water in December 1971 at a mobile studio facility near Montreux, Switzerland, after the casino where they were originally scheduled to record Burn Down during a Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention concert, which is the event the song describes. The track was released in 1972 on the Machine Head album, and the guitar riff that opens it became one of the first things a generation of learner guitarists would attempt. The similarity most often noted is between the Smoke on the Water main riff and the horn line from Richard Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, a 19th century composition entirely outside the reach of copyright law. No legal action was ever possible or filed. Ritchie Blackmore has been asked about the resemblance in interviews over the years, and his answers have typically acknowledged the comparison without accepting it as a source. The broader borrowing discussion around Deep Purple during this period involves the band's substantial debt to earlier rock and blues acts, which was characteristic of British hard rock in the late 1960s and early 1970s generally. Smoke on the Water is not the most legally fraught entry on this list, but the riff's fame and its near-universal recognizability make the question of where it came from worth placing on record. Number 4. Layla by Derek and the Dominoes. Layla was recorded in 1970 by Derek and the Dominoes, the group formed by Eric Clapton following the dissolution of Blind Faith, and released on the double album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. The famous guitar introduction was co-written by Clapton and Duane Allman, and the track is widely regarded as one of the greatest rock recordings of its era. The borrowing story attached to Layla concerns not the main guitar section, but the piano coda, the quieter melodic section that begins roughly 3 minutes into the track. Jim Gordon, the drummer who co-wrote Layla and played on the recording, composed that piano section. Rita Coolidge, who was in a relationship with Gordon at the time of the recording, has said in multiple interviews over the years that the piano melody was hers, something she had composed independently and that Gordon used without her knowledge or consent. No copyright claim was ever filed. Gordon was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and committed a serious violent act in 1983 for which he was imprisoned, circumstances that effectively closed off any possibility of a formal resolution. The piano coda remains credited to Gordon on the official recording, and Coolidge's account of its origins remains part of the historical record, without ever having been tested in court. Number 3. My Love by Paul McCartney and Wings. Paul McCartney released My Love in March 1973 as a single from the Red Rose Speedway album, and it reached number 1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States. The song features a guitar solo by Wings guitarist Henry McCullough that McCartney has described as completely improvised on the day of recording. The conversation around My Love concerns less a specific external source and more a pattern that critics identified at the time. McCartney was accused, with some consistency during the early Wings years, of recycling his own melodic vocabulary, building new songs from the same harmonic and melodic shapes he had used in his earlier work rather than from genuinely new material. That is a different kind of borrowing from anything a court could address, and it was never more than a critical observation rather than a legal claim. What gives it a place on this list is the nature of the accusation, that a composer of McCartney's stature and output was, whether consciously or not, drawing from a fixed well of ideas that had served him well before. The question of whether a songwriter can plagiarize themselves is genuinely interesting, and My Love was cited as an example of that tendency often enough in the mid-1970s press that it belongs in any honest account of the era's borrowing conversations. Number 2. Love is the Drug by Roxy Music. Roxy Music released Love is the Drug in October 1975, and it became the band's first significant American hit, reaching number 30 on the Billboard Hot 100 while performing considerably better in the United Kingdom and Europe. The track is built around a bass line and drum pattern that created a template for a certain strand of art rock and early new wave. The borrowing discussion around the track centers on its rhythmic debt to earlier funk and R&B recordings, and particularly to the Philadelphia soul sound that had dominated American R&B in the early 1970s. The Philly influence on the song's groove was evident enough that it was noted by reviewers at the time. No legal proceedings were ever filed. The song also has clear structural connections to David Bowie's mid-1970s work, which is not surprising, given how extensively the Roxy Music and Bowie worlds overlapped during this period. Brian Ferry has spoken openly in interviews about the breadth of Roxy Music's influences, and the band was never shy about absorbing and transforming the music around them. Love is the Drug is probably better understood as a highly skilled synthesis than a direct appropriation. But the line between those two things is exactly what makes the 1970s such a rich decade for these conversations. Number 1. Ring My Bell by Anita Ward. Anita Ward released Ring My Bell in April 1979, and it became one of the defining singles of the late disco era, reaching number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 in June of that year. The song was written and produced by Frederick Knight, who had originally written it with a younger artist in mind. The lyrics were subsequently revised for Ward before recording. The borrowing discussion associated with Ring My Bell involves its close relationship to the conventions of late 1970s disco production more broadly, and to Knight's own catalog specifically. Knight had worked extensively in soul and R&B production throughout the decade, and elements of the track's construction reflected the formulas he had developed and used across multiple earlier recordings. No formal legal action was ever taken. Ring My Bell closes this list not because it is the most dramatic example of musical borrowing, but because it is one of the most honest. A song that worked precisely because it gave listeners something that sounded familiar, something that fit the shape of what they already loved about the music of that moment. The 1970s were full of those moments. A decade in which music moved fast enough that borrowing, transforming, and building on what came before was not just common, but practically unavoidable. Some of the cases on this list ended in courtrooms with multi-million-dollar judgments. Others were never more than a conversation between musicians or a footnote in an interview, but all of them raised the same question: where does influence end and something else begin? The 1970s did not answer that question. They just made it impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.